Babysitters of Reddit. What seemingly normal parents had dark secrets? My daddy hits my mommy sometimes. For that one, I was still in high school. I told my mom what she said and my mom went to the police station to report it. I like it when you're here, not the other lady. She's mean and she makes me sit in the closet. This little girl was referring to her dad's girlfriend. I told the dad about it and never saw the girlfriend around again. And for some comic relief, my older brother and I play swords in the bathroom. Daddy taught us how, asked him to show me with his action figures what he meant, expecting the worst, and he says look, and goes in his dad's closet and pulls out these giant foam swords. Phew. Thankfully not all in the same house. I babysat a lot when I was 13 to 15. At the time I lived in a small town. I was a very popular babysitter as I also worked at the daycare center. Often I would have kids from 2 or 3 different families at once. I didn't care. I got triple the pay for having 3 different groups of kids. I was recently told why I always had groups of kids like that. Turns out the small town had a swingers club, and I was the go-to babysitter for their different groups. I was babysitting for a local family who owned car dealerships. I answered the phone hello as one does, and it was the father who didn't know his wife had hired a babysitter so she could go to an appointment. He started in with the stupidest sexy voice, until he realized it wasn't wife. He hung up. Later he was caught cheating. Not gonna lie, his loyalty had us in the first half. I never really babysat for anyone besides family, but I did dog sit for a woman and her husband for a while. She gave me a tour of the house the first time I went over there, and there was a room in the back of the house that was filled with dildos and other sex toys. She sold them as a side hustle and wanted me to know they were there, in case I was uncomfortable. They paid me well and left a great review on the site I was using. I wish they never moved. I loved their dogs. I nannied for this very rich family with 3 kids from the West Coast, who would come to South Florida for summer vacation every year. The mother was in her 30s, clearly had her kids when she was young, and was very stereotypically hot, blonde, thin, big boobs, perfect teeth. Her husband was a little older, salt and pepper, super handsome, very George Clooney-esque. The kids were all blonde haired, blue eyed, cute as F. They absolutely adored their parents. Dad would help the kids and mom settle in at the house, and then fly back to Cali for work. I babysat 3 to 5 times a week, 6:30 p.m. to 2 a.m. Mom would get all dolled up, leave her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, and come home very late, clearly drunk, and sometimes brought men home with her that she introduced as her friends. She would often overpay me, which I never complained about, but I worried for the kids. One family, I still don't know what was up with them. It's like they were squatting in a model home or something. It was a fully furnished house that looked to be straight out of Better Homes and Gardens magazine, but there was nothing in the drawers, fridge or cabinets. No toiletries in the bathroom except for toilet paper, no food or silverware in the kitchen, no clothes in the closets or in the kids' drawers, and no toys. The lady just told me to order food for the kids and they watched TV. It was weird. I used to babysit for my next door neighbor who had an 8-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. I was 13 when I started babysitting for them, and I knew off the bat the kids were an interesting duo, to say the least, and I have too many stories to tell from when I was watching them. We all went to school together, so when we got off the bus, we'd walk to their apartment and I'd watch them, made sure we got homework done, and make them the snack of the day. One day, we had a half day at school, and I think the mom forgot, because when we walked into the apartment, I heard one of the doors shut. At the time, we thought it was an intruder, so I grabbed the 5-year-old's baseball bat, told them to stay in the room, and I'd do some investigating. I opened the bathroom door, and there was the mom, half naked, with a guy that wasn't her husband. She gave me all the money in her wallet and her business card. She was a photographer, and told me to never speak of it again. I caught her cheating and made out with $400 and a $650 photo shoot package. Took pictures for all the upcoming holidays so I could keep giving gifts to my family. I babysat them for about 3 months after, before they moved away. I was babysitting once and the kids were wrestling in the living room. All of a sudden the smell of dank filled the room. I hear the kids stop and say, "What is that?" One of them had knocked over a big tin can on a shelf, and the parents' weed stash spilled everywhere. I sent the kids away and cleaned it all up for them and put it back. I babysat for the local policeman when I was teenager. He always came home very drunk and in a weird mood, and one time brought out a homemade Ouija board and persuaded me to take part with his buddies. Always paid me really well. A family member of mine was a babysitter in the 70s. A couple who lived nearby asked her to babysit their baby a few times. I didn't get the sense that she knew them well. Every time she'd go, they said the baby was sleeping and not to disturb the baby by checking on it. The baby never cried. The parents would come home and relieve her. She never saw or heard a baby. At the time I don't think my family member thought much of it, but has told me this story several times because it keeps nagging at her. How could a baby be asleep for the entire time she was there, every time? No noises. Nothing. Today, she thinks there must not have been a baby but has no idea why they'd hire her. This reminds me of a weird babysitting job that I had once, also in the 70s. I got a call from a woman who said that she got my number from a friend. She couldn't remember who, though. She sent a taxi to pick me up and I still remember feeling kind of freaked out, like this was very sketchy. The taxi pulled up at a very old apartment building. For some reason it totally reminded me of the building from Rosemary's Baby. There were 2 women there. The place was just one giant room with a kitchen and bathroom off of it. The lights were dim and the room seemed to be full of beds. But all of the beds were on angles, or pushed together, and there were tons of bedding and clothes all over the place. Whoever I spoke to on the phone told me that there was one 7-year-old boy. But I could clearly see that there were at least 5 kids aged about a year up to maybe 5. No boy who looked to anything close to 7. And all of the kids had longish hair and looked really neglected. The women didn't say much, except that they'd be back around 11. It was only 6 in the evening and all of the kids were asleep, and stayed asleep, except for one toddler who woke up kind of whining, crying for a minute or 2. I couldn't really tell how many kids were there. The blankets and beds were all crazy. There was no food in the fridge. No milk, no nothing. Nothing in the cupboards. There was no TV, which was a real hardship for me. There was only one book. I think it was called Every Woman's Handbook, and it was basically a feminist book about women's bodies. I sat there and read it since there was nothing else to do. After an hour or so I could hear this noise in the kitchen. It literally sounded like a man making demon noises through the kitchen sink drain. Totally scared the shit out of me. 13-year-old me was certain that these women hired me to stay there, and then had someone try to scare me. This was Victoria, BC, during a time when everyone was talking about the satanic church being a big thing, and I was sure that these women, and the demonic sing talker, were Satanists and that I was going to get murdered that night. Oh, and did I mention that they didn't have a phone? The women came back promptly at 11. They paid me a little bit more than what they said they would, which was fair since there were more kids than I was told. Altogether a really freaky night. I was blown away by the fact that the kids were asleep and stayed asleep. Did they drug them? They sent me home in a cab and I was scared for weeks that they were going to show up and kidnap me, or ask me to babysit again. And I was never able to find out how they got my number. I babysit 3 to 5 times a week. You'd be surprised at how many sex toys I see. A lot of them are just out in the open. Like they forgot to hide them. I overnighted once and the guest bed had bondage straps. Parents totally forgot about that. That's not too surprising. But some of their kinks are. Probably the darkest was this 5-year-old girl I babysit. She was the victim of sexual assault for a couple years by an aunt and uncle. No charges pressed or anything. Mom and dad just cut all contact with that side of the family. I live in a small town so I see the aunt pretty often. It's sickening. They understandably have a ton of cameras set up in their house now, and aren't gone for more than a couple hours. The child has a very weird bedtime routine, which is how I found out. Not so much as dark but really sad. I babysat for a typical upper middle class family. Dad worked, mom was stay at home. The mother was always a little overprotective, like checking on their daughter the second they got home, but I didn't think much of it. One night they came home and we talked a little. She mentioned how much she loved children and her daughter, so I asked her if they ever thought about having another. She completely broke down and explained that she had multiple miscarriages before and after her daughter, so they stopped trying. I felt really awful and really sad because it seems like she wanted another baby. I'm not sure if this counts, but this is my secret between myself and my nephew. My sister was 23 or 24 and she was going through her divorce. She and her 3-year-old son came to live with us. I was in high school at the time and devoted all of my after school time to him. He and I were close. We were so close I would be on the couch with him in my lap at 3 AM watching In the Night Garden for the billionth time, still in my school uniform, but now smelling of regurgitated milk and doing math homework with my left arm. Meanwhile my sister would be out partying and whatnot. One day, it was just my nephew and I. At the time he was I think around 4. I was in my school uniform, getting ready to leave for school. He was helping me get ready by putting his favorite toys in my bag. As I was heading out, I told him that I loved him like usual, and he replied, "I love you too, mommy." I was stunned, but I was already running late, so I brushed it off and went to school. After that, when we were alone, my nephew started calling me mommy. He was genuine. I asked him what about mommy, and he tells me how she doesn't really love me. You love me. And Nanny loves me. I tried to encourage him to call me auntie again, and he did when others were around. But when we were alone he looked at me with his sweet little eyes and called me mommy. He eventually says, "I wish you were my real mommy." Tantrums become more common for him. He throws them when his mum is around, and begins to avoid her hugs. Her hugs were only there to pose for selfies and to show off what a good parent she is. He would start crying and screaming, and get sent to his room for misbehaving. My mum, Nanny, and my sister would go out and leave me in charge. I would then go to my nephew and give him a big ol' bear hug. I'm not the parent and he isn't my child, but our secret was mutual. I wished he were my child and he wished I was his mum. We had to keep our wishes secret because if my sister knew that I was ruining her image by taking all of the mother-son love, then hell would have broken loose. She was all about self-image to the point she became a compulsive liar, and she also has some other mental problems. His teachers noticed our bond when he entered primary school, and his after-school babysitters knew about his other mum. My nephew is 10 now. I don't know if he remembers any of this, but the other day was my birthday and for the very first time, he tried to earn money through chores to buy me a gift himself. It was a Squirtle Amiibo. TLDR, my baby nephew and I developed a secret mother/son bond that only teachers and babysitters picked up on, and it had to be secret because his real mum is crazy. I used to nanny for a family. At the interview they seemed totally normal, even the first day wasn't too terrible. I quickly realized that both parents were abusive. Mom had severe anger issues, and was medicated for some condition related to it. Dad was a borderline sexual predator who constantly talked about how gross looking his wife was, and how if she didn't stop being a bitch, he'd divorce her. Their kids were just as bad. One of them was also medicated for behavioral issues. I found out later that the reason they were hiring a nanny opposed to daycare was because their kids had been kicked out of the daycares in the area. Nope, the fuck out of that situation within a few months. I worked full-time for a family with 11 and 8-year-old girls. Mom played everything off like they were all happy and perfect. They treated the 11-year-old like a queen and constantly cut the 8-year-old down. Dad was sleeping in another room, and clearly couldn't stand the mom. She's played off like he was just grumpy in the mornings. I never understood why people think the nanny won't know. We know everything. I worked at a daycare center. To be clear, these parents did not seem very normal. Mom had fake inflated Kardashian-sized boobs and butt and was generally very conceited, like almost a stereotype of a person with a body that augmented. She stood out among the other parents who picked up their kids from the daycare after working 12-hour shifts scrubbing floors and doing other blue-collar labor. Large immigrant community. Dad was more down to earth, so it seemed. Younger brother, age 7, told me he was anxious one day. He tended to be a worrywart, so I wasn't surprised, but I asked him why. He says that his dad yells at his mom a lot because she gets drunk, goes out and parties with her friends, and then he has to go and pick her up, which leads to a lot of arguing. I told him that that's really sad and that we would say a prayer for them. It was a Christian day. A week or so later he excitedly told me that the prayer worked, and his parents weren't arguing anymore. While Mac does say that all things are possible through God, so jot that down. I was only tentatively optimistic about younger brother's revelation. Older brother, 8, was a completely different personality, a bully to the kids and adults, never had a positive thing to say. The things he seemed to like were his younger brother, Fortnite and Roblox, like you do. Most of the school year we had butted heads trying to get him to do homework, but towards the end of the year his behavior changed. He would say he was too stupid to do homework, and would try to hold his breath to try and commit suicide, in his own words. This seems like a huge red flag, and he eventually broke down and said that his dad was abusive towards him, and that his mom says she doesn't like being around him. While he was prone to lying, he was crying, something he never did, and his behavior was like nothing me and my co-workers had never seen. That was my first time calling CPS, and when the next school year started, those kids didn't come back. Work in an elementary school. A lot of horrifying, unexpected stuff tends to come up. I handle any behavioral calls, so tend to have a lot of contact with kids who are having trouble self-regulating in school. Sometimes these kids genuinely have a hard time, but often they can't regulate because they are in hyperdrive with what's going on at home. I had a mom tell me, in detail, the sex life between her and her ex. Another parent was arrested for drug trafficking and went to jail for 3 years a week after he'd attended parent-teacher conferences. Another parent got into a fight in the lobby and 911 had to be called. I babysat for this one family only a couple of times when I was 16. But on the first night they just casually talked about how I needed to call the police if the kid's biological dad turned up at the house. I was then told I would need to barricade us all in their master bathroom, and I should call them and their lawyer. Custody battles suck. I was a nanny for a young boy with additional needs. Let's call the parents John and Lisa. John worked for Lisa's parents as they owned a painting company. This company had the family surname as its name. One day I noticed John was home from work early in the painting van, but it had his surname as the company name on the van, not Lisa's parents' surname. I thought it was a funny coincidence that he and Lisa had the same surname, and so I pointed this out. He froze up and looked a little awkward and said, "Oh, that's because Lisa and I are first cousins. They shared the same paternal grandparents and therefore the same surname. They had been together since they were young teenagers. I'm not actually sure if this is legal or not, but it's certainly frowned up here." I was giving the 4-year-old a bath and he asked me, "Why don't you touch me like dad does?" That was my first red flag. Eventually the dad would show up at home unannounced to just hang out with me when the kids were napping. I was 18. One day he got a vasectomy and told me if I wanted he could send a couple blank shots at me. A few days later he full on assaulted me. I locked myself in the bedroom and called his wife. She wouldn't believe me. I called my brother and he rushed over with a baseball bat. Seemingly a happy family, but the child had a lot of odd behaviors. The most obvious one was she'd cry if you laughed in front of her. Her mom told me the 4-year-old child would assume you were laughing at her. One time I group babysat at a neighbor's house with this child, and when the father came to pick the child up, the neighbor's dog went ballistic and tried to bite him. Shortly after it came out that the dad was abusing the daughter. Always trust the dog. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more daily Reddit videos.